The face of Lieutenant Almeida, previously red with rage and arrogance, instantly paled, turning as white as paper. His air of superiority vanished, replaced by icy dread. The reveal of her identity wasn't just a revelation, it was a hammer blow. The federal judge, with the same calm that had irritated him, picked up her cell phone. "I'm calling your immediate superior, Lieutenant, and I assure you, he'll have plenty to say about how you represent the law and shove elderly women in traffic." Lieutenant Almeida's arrogance crumbled right there, under the gaze of a few curious onlookers, as Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos, with her unshakable composure, prepared to dispense true justice. The silence that followed Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos's declaration was more deafening than any traffic horn. Lieutenant Almeida, who moments before saw himself as the owner of the street, was now just a man in a panic, caught in the trap of his own arrogance. His face, previously pale, began to flush with a reddish tinge of shame and fear. The hand that had pushed the elderly woman now trembled, and he instinctively took a step back, as if the judge were a mythical figure capable of evaporating him with a glance. "No, you don't need to do that, Your Honor," he stammered, his voice failing, words stumbling in his throat. "It was a misunderstanding. I didn't know. Please, I apologize. 1,000 apologies." The judge, however, showed no intention of backing down. Her slender, elegant fingers were already dialing a number on her cell phone with a precision that brutally contrasted with the lieutenant's emotional disarray. She didn't even look at him, keeping her focus on the device's screen, as if Almeida were a mere obstacle in her path, easily ignored. "Misunderstanding, Lieutenant Almeida." Her voice was a silken thread, yet sharp as a razor, shoving a citizen in traffic, harassing her, threatening her with an unfounded fine, and on top of that, abusing your authority. Is that what you call a misunderstanding? I believe the Criminal Code's dictionary has a slightly different definition for those acts. The lieutenant felt a cold sweat trickle down his neck, dampening his uniform collar. The Criminal Code. The words echoed in his mind, transforming into imaginary handcuffs. His career, his reputation, everything he had built with such effort, or more precisely, with such arrogance, was now hanging by a thread in the hands of a woman he had treated with the deepest contempt. "Your Honor, I was under pressure. The traffic, you know, and the scratch on my car. It was a moment of losing control. I swear it will never happen again. I deeply regret it." He tried to approach, hands raised in a gesture of supplication, but she merely raised an eyebrow, a clear sign for him to keep his distance. The call connected. The judge brought the phone to her ear, and Lieutenant Almeida felt his heart leap into his throat. He could hear the call's beep, and then a muffled male voice on the other end, audible enough for him to know it was real. "Colonel Mendez, please," she said, her voice clear and concise without a hint of emotion. "This is Helena Vasconcelos, federal judge. Yes, I know it's a bit late to call, but I had a rather unpleasant and concerning incident involving one of your officers, Lieutenant Almeida." Every word was a nail in the coffin of the lieutenant's career. He closed his eyes for an instant, wishing the ground would open up and swallow him. Colonel Mendez was known for his rectitude and for not tolerating misconduct. Almeida knew he was in serious trouble. "Yes, Colonel, he just shoved me in traffic, claiming a scratch on his car, and tried to coerce me with a fine. All this after an argument where he showed complete disregard for me and for the law he should defend. Yes, I am Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos, the lady he just physically and morally assaulted." Lieutenant Almeida felt the air thin in his lungs. Physically and morally assaulted. The gravity of the accusations was overwhelming. He tried to interrupt, to blurt something out, but the judge merely ignored him, keeping her gaze fixed on a distant point as if she were reciting a report. "No, Colonel, there was no resistance on my part. I merely tried to remain calm and civil, which he clearly failed to do. I have witnesses too, some citizens who saw the scene, and of course my own statement, which will be formalized. You understand the seriousness of this, don't you? An officer of your corporation on duty, assaulting an elderly woman, and coincidentally a federal judge. It's a case of abuse of authority, minor bodily harm, and, I would say, even contempt of public office, given the way he behaved. The judge paused briefly, listening to the colonel's response. Lieutenant Almeida could imagine the fury in his superior's voice. His mind raced, trying to find a way out, an excuse, anything that could mitigate the imminent disaster. But there was nothing. He had dug his own grave with the shovel of his arrogance. Yes, Colonel, I understand. I appreciate your prompt attention. I hope the appropriate measures will be taken with the urgency and seriousness that the case demands. It's not just about me, Colonel. It's about the public's trust in the police. It's about respect for the law and human dignity. An officer who acts this way is not fit to wear a badge. She hung up the phone, putting it back in her pocket with the same calm with which she had taken it out. Finally, her eyes turned to Lieutenant Almeida, who now seemed to have shrunk in size, his upright posture replaced by a slump of despair. "Well, Lieutenant Almeida," she said, her voice now a little graver but still controlled. "Colonel Mendez is aware of the situation. He assured me that you will be immediately suspended for investigation and that an administrative process will be opened. And of course the legal measures I decide to take as a citizen and as a magistrate will run their course." Almeida felt a chill run down his spine. Suspended. Administrative process. Legal measures. His career was in ruins. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. His throat was dry, tight. I beg you, Your Honor, please, don't do this. I have a family. I'll lose everything." Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos observed him with a look that was not of anger, but of cold, calculated disappointment. "You should have thought of your family before shoving an elderly woman in traffic, Lieutenant. You should have thought of the consequences before abusing the power entrusted to you. The law is for everyone, Lieutenant. And justice, my dear, has a peculiar way of manifesting itself, especially when underestimated." She gave one last look at the scratched car, then at the lieutenant, who now looked like a ghost in his own uniform. With an almost imperceptible sigh, she turned and walked towards her car, leaving Lieutenant Almeida alone, under the curious gaze of the few passers-by who were still watching, with the weight of his actions collapsing upon him. The damage to the car was insignificant compared to the damage he had just done to his own life. Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos had in fact dispensed true justice, and Lieutenant Almeida was about to reap the bitter fruits of his arrogance. Lieutenant Almeida remained motionless, like a pillar of salt, as Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos walked away. Each step she took towards her car was a hammer blow to his already fragile structure of arrogance. The silence the judge left behind was filled only by the distant hum of traffic and the echo of her words in his mind. Suspended. Administrative process. Legal measures. His career, which he believed to be unshakable, crumbled before his eyes, not with a bang, but with a chilling whisper of inevitability. The few curious onlookers who had watched the scene, previously just passive spectators, now looked at him with a mixture of curiosity, contempt, and even a certain relief. The man who moments before had intimidated them with his authority was now a pathetic figure, shrunken in his own uniform. The uniform, once a symbol of power, now seemed like a shroud, weighing on his shoulders like an unbearable burden. Almeida felt the blush of shame creep up his neck. But it was not the blush of anger, but of public humiliation. He wanted to disappear, for the asphalt to open up and swallow him, taking with it the badge, the weapon, and the memory of that day. The judge reached her car, opened the door with the same deliberate calm, and sat down. Before starting the engine, she cast one last glance in the rearview mirror. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a serene sadness, as if she regretted the necessity of such a lesson. For her, it was not a personal victory, but the reaffirmation of a fundamental principle. The law is for everyone, and power, when abused, finds its own limit. The engine purred softly, and the car, with its almost imperceptible scratch, drove away, taking with it the imposing figure of justice and leaving Lieutenant Almeida behind in a limbo of despair. He was still standing there, on the curb, when the shrill ring of his cell phone jolted him from his stupor. The name flashing on the screen was Colonel Mendez. Almeida's heart leapt into his throat, and his hands trembled so much he almost dropped the device. He knew what was coming. The colonel was not a man of euphemisms. With a choked voice and a dry throat, Almeida answered, "Lieutenant Almeida, sir." Colonel Mendez's voice, on the other end of the line, was a contained thunder, laden with a silent fury that was far more terrifying than any shout. "Almeida, what the hell do you think you're doing? Shoving a federal judge? Have you lost your mind?" "I just got off the phone with Dr. Helena Vasconcelos. Do you have any idea of the gravity of what you've done?" Almeida tried to stammer an excuse, an explanation, anything that could mitigate the catastrophe. "Colonel, I didn't know. It was a misunderstanding. The traffic, the scratch on the car." "Shut up, Almeida." The colonel's voice cut him like a blade. "Don't give me flimsy excuses. An officer of my corporation on duty, assaulting a citizen, an elderly woman, and on top of that, a federal judge? That's not a misunderstanding, it's a crime. It's abuse of authority, bodily harm, and an indelible stain on the reputation of our institution." The lieutenant felt a cold sweat run all over his body, drenching his uniform. The colonel's words were like sentences, each one sealing his fate. I'm so sorry, Colonel. I swear I regret it." "Regretting it now is too late, Lieutenant. The judge was clear. She has witnesses, and I, personally, do not tolerate this kind of conduct. You are immediately suspended from your duties, effective this very moment. Understood? Your badge and your weapon will be collected. A patrol car is already on its way to pick you up and initiate administrative procedures. And prepare yourself, Almeida, because the lawsuit Dr. Vasconcelos will file against you will only be the beginning of your problems." The call was abruptly ended. The cell phone slipped from Almeida's hands and fell onto the asphalt, the screen cracking in a spiderweb pattern, a perfect mirror of his own shattered life. Suspended, badge and weapon collected, administrative process, lawsuit. The words spun in his mind, a whirlpool of despair. He looked at his own hands, the same hands that had pushed an elderly woman, the same hands that now trembled uncontrollably. The arrogance that had propelled him for so long, that had made him feel invincible, had now led him to ruin. The scratch on the car, the origin of all his fury, now seemed like a cruel joke, an insignificant detail that had triggered an avalanche. He had traded minor material damage for irreparable harm to his career, his reputation, and perhaps his freedom. Lieutenant Almeida, once a predator in traffic, was now the prey, cornered by the consequences of his own arrogance. The distant sound of a siren approached, and he knew that justice, in its most relentless form, was coming for him. The sound of the siren, previously distant, now tore through the air with relentless urgency, growing in volume with each second, like a harbinger of imminent doom. It wasn't the siren he activated to assert his authority, but one coming to take him away, to seal his fate. Lieutenant Almeida, still paralyzed on the curb, saw a police car approach and stop a few meters from him. It wasn't the colonel's car, but a common patrol, the kind he dispatched daily to minor incidents. The irony was cruel. a punch to the gut. Two police officers, a man and a woman, both younger than him, emerged from the vehicle. Almeida recognized them. They were agents he had trained, who had looked at him with respect, perhaps even admiration. Now, their faces were a mask of cold professionalism, devoid of any emotion that might betray surprise or judgment. They knew. The news traveled fast through the corporation's corridors. "Lieutenant Almeida?" the taller officer asked, his voice neutral, but with a formality Almeida had never heard from a subordinate. Almeida merely nodded, unable to form words. His throat was as dry as a desert, and his heart beat a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "We received orders from Colonel Mendez. You are suspended from your duties with immediate effect. We need to collect your badge and your weapon." Every word was a stab. The badge, the weapon, the symbols of his identity, of his power, of his life. He felt his hands tremble uncontrollably as he unclipped the badge from his belt and handed it over. The cold metal, which once gave him a sense of invincibility, now seemed to burn his fingers. Then, with a slow and painful movement, he removed the pistol from its holster. The weapon, his faithful companion in so many situations, seemed to weigh a ton. He handed it, the grip still warm from his body, to the officer who received it with the same calculated coldness. The young officer's eyes met for a brief instant, a flash of something Almeida couldn't decipher. Perhaps pity, perhaps disappointment, perhaps just the confirmation that the law indeed was for everyone. "Please, Lieutenant, accompany us to the patrol car," the female officer said, indicating the back seat. The back seat, the place reserved for detainees, for criminals, never for an officer, much less for him, Lieutenant Almeida. The humiliation was unbearable. He felt the eyes of the few passers-by who were still watching the scene burn into his back. The image of him, a lieutenant of the military police, being taken in the back seat of a patrol car, would be the gossip of the day, the week, perhaps the month. He got into the car, the rough fabric seat feeling harder than ever. The door closed with a dry thud, a sound that echoed like the closing of a coffin. The outside world, once his domain, now watched him through the darkened glass, distant and unattainable. The patrol car departed smoothly, without the lights or siren that had taken him to so many places. It was a silent journey, laden with a weight Almeida had never experienced. He looked at the streets he knew so well, at the buildings, at the people. Everything seemed the same, but he was different. He was a man stripped bare, disgraced, on his way to an uncertain and bleak future. His mind was a whirlwind of regret and despair. The scratch, a meager scratch. How could he have let something so insignificant lead him to such a point? The judge, Helena Vasconcelos. Her name resonated in his head, a mantra of his own ruin. The arrogance, the hubris, the belief that his uniform placed him above everything and everyone. He had underestimated everyone, especially her. The car turned a familiar corner, and the battalion building came into view. The barracks he had called home for so many years, where he had built his career, where he had dreamed of promotions and recognition. Now, it looked like a somber castle, its walls erected not to protect him, but to judge him. As it stopped in front of the main entrance, Almeida noticed that some colleagues were at the guardhouse, others in the parking area. Their gazes turned to the patrol car and then to him, with a mixture of shock and curiosity. He felt his face burn with shame. There was no longer the respect, the camaraderie. Only the awkward silence and the glances that weighed on him like 1,000 tons. The officers opened the door and escorted him inside. The corridor, once a stage for laughter and lively conversations, now seemed like a death row. Each step was an effort, each sound an echo of his disgrace. They took him directly to an administrative room where a sergeant, with whom Almeida had shared countless coffees, awaited him with a pile of papers. "Lieutenant Almeida," the sergeant said, his voice low and formal, without the usual chief or sir. "Colonel Mendez has ordered us to initiate the administrative process. Immediate suspension, collection of credentials, and corporate assets." Almeida sat in the indicated chair, feeling small and vulnerable. The sergeant began to read the terms of the suspension, the preliminary accusations: abuse of authority, bodily harm, contempt. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his career. He listened, but the words seemed distant, unreal. It was as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life. He thought of his wife, his children. How would he tell them? How would he explain that the man they admired, the pillar of the family, had thrown everything away for a scratch and a fit of rage? The future, which once seemed so secure, was now a dark abyss. Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos had not only humiliated him, she had dismantled his life piece by piece with the surgical precision of the justice he had so disrespected. And worst of all, he knew the fault was entirely his. Arrogance had taken its toll, and the bill was unpayable. The sergeant, whose name Almeida barely registered now, continued to read the terms of the suspension. The preliminary accusations: abuse of authority, bodily harm, contempt. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his career, each syllable an echo of the ruin he himself had built. Almeida felt small and vulnerable, a puppet whose strings had been cut. His mind, previously a whirlwind of despair, now seemed enveloped in a dense fog, the sergeant's words sounding distant, unreal. It was as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life, a tragedy in which he was the involuntary protagonist. He was instructed to sign a series of documents, each one sealing another piece of his fate. The formal notification of suspension, the term for the collection of credentials, the list of corporate assets that had been confiscated. His hand, which once wielded a weapon with the firmness of one who held power, now trembled uncontrollably as he picked up the pen. The ink seemed to bleed onto the paper, a dark smudge that mirrored the bleeding of his career, of his reputation. The sergeant, in a lapse of habit, almost offered him a coffee, but the offer died on his lips, swallowed by the invisible barrier that now separated them. Almeida was no longer a colleague, a superior. He was a case, a problem to be processed. His personal belongings, the cell phone with the cracked screen, the wallet with the badge that was no longer his, the keys to his house and car, were catalogued with bureaucratic coldness. Each item registered was a reminder of his stripped identity. He felt naked, not just without his uniform, but without the armor of his authority, without the persona he had cultivated for years. The humiliation was a slow poison, corroding him from within. The sergeant, with a formal voice and none of the previous familiarity, explained the next steps. A formal inquiry would be opened by the Military Police Internal Affairs. The investigation would be thorough, impartial, with no room for the flimsy excuses he had tried to stammer to Colonel Mendez. Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos, with her impeccable reputation and network of contacts, would be the main witness. In addition, there were the other drivers who witnessed the scene, perhaps even a security camera from a nearby establishment. The evidence against him, Almeida knew, would be overwhelming. His mind, previously focused on the anger over the scratch, now turned to the judge, Helena Vasconcelos. Her name resonated in his head, no longer as a distant threat, but as the personification of the relentless justice he had challenged. He had catastrophically underestimated her, mistaking her age and apparent fragility for weakness. What a fool he had been. Arrogance had blinded him, made him believe that his uniform made him untouchable, above the laws he swore to protect. The sergeant finished reading, stacking the papers with a final gesture. "You will be escorted home, Lieutenant Almeida. Not in an official patrol car to avoid further exposure. An unmarked car will be waiting for you at the side exit." Another layer of humiliation. He was no longer worthy of being transported in a corporate vehicle, not even as a detainee. He was a pariah, an embarrassment to be hidden. The walk to the side exit was a calvary. He passed colleagues who, minutes before, had greeted him with respect. Now their gazes were averted, conversations abruptly ceased or were whispered. Some looked at him with pity, others with a silent judgment that weighed more than 1,000 words. The awkward silence was deafening, a chorus of disapproval he felt in every fiber of his being. The unmarked car, a common sedan, was waiting for him. The driver, an agent he didn't recognize, opened the rear door with the same cold formality as the others. Almeida got in, feeling the ordinary fabric seat beneath him, so different from the leather upholstery of his own car or the robustness of the patrol cars. The door closed with a soft click, but to him it sounded like the closing of a cell. The drive home was silent. The driver focused on the road, making no eye contact. Almeida looked out the window at the streets he knew so well, at the buildings, at the people going about their lives. Oblivious to his personal tragedy, everything seemed the same, but he was different. He was a man stripped bare, disgraced, on his way to an uncertain and bleak future. His mind was a whirlwind of regret and despair. The scratch, a meager scratch. How could he have let something so insignificant lead him to such a point? Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos had not only humiliated him, she had dismantled his life piece by piece with the surgical precision of the justice he had so disrespected. And worst of all, he knew the fault was entirely his. Arrogance had taken its toll, and the bill was unpayable. The car stopped in front of his house. The house he had built with such effort, the home of his family. How would he tell them? How would he explain that the man they admired, the pillar of the family, had thrown everything away for a fit of rage and arrogance? The future, which once seemed so secure, was now a dark abyss, and he was about to fall into it without a parachute. The judge's shadow loomed over his life, a constant reminder that the law, after all, was for everyone. And he, Lieutenant Almeida, was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The car stopped in front of his house, the house he had built with such effort, the home of his family, the refuge where the uniform was hung and the persona of authority gave way to husband and father. But today, that home seemed like a courtroom, and he, the defendant. The judge's shadow loomed over his life, a constant reminder that the law, after all, was for everyone. And he, Lieutenant Almeida, was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The agent, with the same cold formality, opened the rear door. Almeida hesitated for an instant, one foot on the hot asphalt, the other still inside the car. It was as if he were on the edge of a precipice, and the next step would lead him into the unknown. The street air, previously familiar, now felt heavy, laden with a silent expectation. He got out of the car, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, and the agent closed the door with a soft click, a sound that sealed his isolation. The unmarked sedan drove away without a goodbye, leaving him alone on the sidewalk. A man without a uniform, without a badge, without the armor that defined him. He walked up the small stone pathway, each step a battle against the gravity of his own shame. The front door, painted a vibrant blue that his wife, Anna, had chosen, seemed heavier than ever. He turned the key, the metallic sound echoing in the afternoon silence. As he entered, the smell of fresh coffee and the muffled sound of the television coming from the living room enveloped him, a normalcy he was about to destroy. Anna emerged from the kitchen, a smile on her face that slowly faded as she saw him. Her eyes, previously full of warmth, now narrowed in confusion. He wasn't in uniform. There was no usual sparkle in his gaze. And the car that had dropped him off, it wasn't his, nor a patrol car. Almeida, what happened? Why are you home so early? And why aren't you in your uniform? Her voice was a mixture of concern and a hint of apprehension. She approached, reaching out to touch his arm, but he instinctively recoiled, as if his disgrace were contagious. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, a tight knot of guilt and fear. His eyes swept the room, searching for an escape, a hiding place. He saw the children's toys scattered on the rug, a colorful drawing pinned to the refrigerator. The innocence of that home, the life he had sworn to protect and sustain, now seemed fragile, about to crumble under the weight of his irresponsibility. "Anna, I made a huge mistake." His voice came out hoarse, almost a whisper. He couldn't face her. The disappointment in her eyes would be a harder blow than any reprimand from a superior. Ina's smile had completely vanished, replaced by an expression of growing dread. "What mistake, Almeida? Talk to me. You're scaring me." He finally lifted his eyes, meeting hers. The pain and shame were palpable on his face. "I've been suspended, indefinitely, and there will be an administrative process. I might even be expelled." The words once spoken seemed to echo in the room, filling every corner with their ugliness. Anna stumbled backward, leaning against the wall, a hand on her chest as if trying to ward off a heart attack. Her lips trembled and her eyes filled with tears. She tried in vain to hold back. "Suspended? Expelled? Why? What did you do, for God's sake?" Her voice rose in pitch, incredulity mixed with nascent anger. Almeida felt himself shrink. The story seemed even more pathetic when told aloud. It was because of a scratch on the car. I lost my head, Anna. I shoved an elderly woman, but she was a federal judge, Helena Vasconcelos." The judge's name, uttered in a low voice, resonated like thunder. Anna brought her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "You shoved a federal judge? Almeida, have you gone mad? Because of a scratch? A scratch!" Anger now dominated her voice, overriding her dread. "You threw everything away, your career, our future, our children's security, for a scratch and your damned pride." Her words were arrows, each one hitting a sensitive spot in his heart. He couldn't deny it. She was right. The arrogance, the hubris, the belief that his uniform placed him above everything and everyone. He had underestimated everyone, especially her, the judge, and now his own wife. "I'm so sorry, Anna. I don't know what came over me. I lost control." He reached out to her, but she recoiled even further. "Being sorry won't bring your career back, Almeida. It won't pay the bills. It won't erase the shame you brought upon our family." She turned, her shoulders trembling, and ran to the bedroom, leaving him alone in the living room, surrounded by the echoes of his own words and the deafening silence of his ruin. He heard Anna's muffled crying coming from the bedroom, and the sound broke his heart into 1,000 pieces. His children, luckily, were not home, perhaps at their grandmother's house, spared for now from the devastating scene. But how would he tell them? How would he explain that the man they admired, the pillar of the family, had thrown everything away for a fit of rage and arrogance? The future, which once seemed so secure, was now a dark abyss, and he was about to fall into it without a parachute. Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos had not only humiliated him, she had dismantled his life piece by piece with the surgical precision of the justice he had so disrespected. And worst of all, he knew the fault was entirely his. Arrogance had taken its toll, and the bill was unpayable. He was alone in his own home, confronted with the brutal truth of his actions, and the weight of that truth was unbearable. He was alone in his own home, confronted with the brutal truth of his actions, and the weight of that truth was unbearable. Anna's crying, muffled by the bedroom door, was a sound sharper than any patrol car siren, more painful than any reprimand from a superior. It was the sound of his family breaking, piece by piece, because of him. He remained there, in the middle of the living room, like a castaway on dry land, not knowing where to go or what to do. The smell of fresh coffee, once a comfort, now seemed a cruel reminder of the normalcy he had shattered. The children's toys on the rug, the colorful drawing on the refrigerator, each item was a silent accusation, a monument to the innocence he had profaned with his irresponsibility. Almeida's mind was a battlefield. The rage, which once consumed and propelled him, now turned against himself, a self-destructive fury. How could he have been so blind, so stupid? A scratch, a meager scratch. The image of the judge's dented bumper, then her hand on his chest, the shove and her gaze, that cold, calculating gaze that promised ruin, all replayed in his mind like a horror movie. He had underestimated not only the law, but the very essence of justice, personified in that grey-haired woman with a firm voice. He walked to the window, watching the sun begin to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was an evening like many others, but for him it was the end of an era, the era of Lieutenant Almeida, the man in uniform, the pillar of the community, the defender of order. Now he was just Almeida, a potentially unemployed man, a husband who had disappointed his wife, a father who would have to explain the inexplicable. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by Anna's intermittent crying. He felt a void in his stomach, a dizzying sensation. The indefinite suspension was just the beginning. The administrative process, the expulsion, the loss of his pension, benefits, the identity he had built over years of service, the financial security he so cherished, which guaranteed his family's comfort, was now a fragile illusion, about to disintegrate. How would he pay the bills? The mortgage? The children's school? The future he had planned so carefully, with every promotion, every bonus, was now a sandcastle washed away by a single wave of fury. He sat on the sofa, sinking into the soft upholstery, feeling small and insignificant. The uniform, which granted him power and respect, now seemed a burden, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He had clung so tightly to that image of authority, to the feeling of being untouchable, that he forgot humility, decency, basic respect for others. Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos had not only applied the law, she had stripped his soul bare, exposing his arrogance and hubris for the world to see. Shame was a heavy, suffocating cloak. He imagined the looks of his colleagues, the whispers in the police station corridors, the scandal in the local newspapers. His reputation, built with such effort, was in ruins. And worst of all, he knew there was no one to blame but himself. It wasn't a conspiracy, it wasn't an injustice. It was the direct consequence of his own actions, of his inability to control an explosive temper. He thought of his children. How would they react? They saw him as a hero, a strong and just man. How would he tell them that their father, the lieutenant, had acted like a criminal, pushing a defenseless elderly woman because of a scratch on his car? The image of them smiling and hugging him was a dagger in his heart. He had failed them, Anna, his own family. The phone rang, and Almeida flinched. Who could it be? A colleague? A superior? He ignored it, letting it ring until it went to voicemail. He wasn't ready to face anyone else, to hear more judgments, to feel more pity or contempt. He needed time to process the magnitude of his fall, to understand how his life had turned into a nightmare in a matter of hours. Anna's bedroom door opened, and she emerged, her eyes swollen and red, but with an expression of cold determination. She wasn't crying anymore. There was a hardness in her gaze that Almeida had never seen before. "We need to talk, Almeida, and it's not about what you did, because that's already done. It's about what we're going to do now, about how we're going to survive this, because whether you like it or not, we're still a family. And I won't let your irresponsibility destroy everything we've built." Her voice was firm, devoid of emotion, and Almeida knew that the hardest battle of his life was just beginning. The judge had dismantled his career, But Anna was there to try to rebuild the wreckage of his personal life, even if he didn't deserve it. And the weight of that responsibility, of having to face the uncertain and bleak future he himself had created, was almost unbearable. Anna's voice, devoid of tears, was a sharp edge cutting through the heavy air of the living room. There was no longer the uncontrolled fury of minutes ago, nor the dread that had made her stumble. Now, only a cold determination, a resilience Almeida had never seen in her with such intensity. He watched her, paralyzed on the sofa, feeling like an insect under a microscope. Lieutenant Almeida, the man who saw himself in control of everything, was now at the mercy of the woman he had hurt so deeply, and the irony was a poison burning in his veins. She didn't wait for an answer. She walked to the coffee table, picked up a notepad and a pen, and sat in the armchair opposite him without averting her gaze. Her eyes, though swollen, carried a frightening clarity, a resolution that was almost more intimidating than her previous anger. It was as if, at the epicenter of the chaos he had created, Anna had found a strength she didn't even know she possessed, a strength born of necessity and the instinct for survival. "We're not going to discuss the past, Almeida," she began, her voice low, but each word a hammer. "What's done is done now. We need to be practical. What does indefinite suspension mean? What's the timeline for the administrative process? And more importantly, what's our financial situation?" The barrage of questions, so direct and incisive, hit Almeida like a series of punches to the stomach. He hadn't thought about the practical details, only the shame, the loss, the humiliation. His mind was clouded by guilt, unable to process the logistics of his own ruin. I don't know, Anna," he stammered, his voice hoarse, almost inaudible. "They haven't given me the details yet. They just said it would be immediate and I should wait, and that my salary would be cut, of course." The sound of Anna's pen scratching on paper was the only noise in the room, a sound that seemed amplified by the tension, punctuating the gravity of each word. Cut? Completely? Or is there some kind of aid during the suspension? She wasn't accusing him, not reprimanding him. She was just seeking information, like a lawyer preparing a case, and this coldness was more devastating than any shout, for it demonstrated an acceptance of reality that he still couldn't grasp. I think completely, until the process is concluded. If I'm expelled, I lose everything. Pension, benefits. The words barely left his throat, each one a brick in the wall rising between him and the life he knew, sealing him in a prison of consequences. Anna wrote, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Okay, so we need a contingency plan. Our savings. How much do we have in the bank? And the mortgage, the car, the children's school, the grocery bills, electricity, water." She listed item by item, and each one was a vivid reminder of the security he had thrown away, the stability he had promised his family. Almeida felt a cold sweat run down his neck. He had always been the provider, the financial pillar. Now he had no answers, just the feeling of a growing emptiness in his stomach. Not much, Anna. The savings. We used part for the bathroom renovation last year, and the car. The payment is high. The school, I don't know. The confession of his ignorance was a blow to his pride, an acknowledgement of his complete lack of preparation for the disaster he himself had caused. Frustration, contained, showed in Anna's eyes, a momentary flicker of despair that she quickly suppressed. "You don't know. Almeida, how could you be so irresponsible, not think of any of this? We live on one salary, yours, and now we have nothing." Her voice rose slightly, but she quickly controlled herself, returning to her firm, almost robotic posture. "All right. No panic. We'll have to cut expenses drastically. I can pick up more shifts at the clinic. Maybe sell the car, if the payments are unsustainable. And the school. Maybe we'll have to transfer the children to a public school, at least for now. Every suggestion from Ana was a stab to Almeida's heart. Selling the car he loved so much, seeing his children taken from the school they adored, Ana working exhaustively to cover his failures. The image of his family, once so comfortable and secure, now falling apart before his eyes, was unbearable. A nightmare materializing in his own living room. "No, Ana, we can't do that to the children. They don't deserve—" He tried to argue, but his voice failed, choked by emotion and helplessness. She interrupted him bluntly, her voice like a cold blade. "And what do they deserve, Almeida? To have a father who lost his head over a scratch and threw away everyone's future? They deserve to have a father who regrets and tries to fix things. And I deserve a husband who faces reality, no matter how hard it is." The truth in her words was undeniable, and Almeida felt himself sink further into the sofa, the weight of his guilt crushing him, suffocating him. Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos, even absent, was the shadow looming over the room, over their lives. She had not only punished Almeida, she had forced his family to confront the fragility of their existence, built on the sand of his arrogance. Her justice was relentless, not only with the guilty, but with everyone around him, dismantling each life with the precision of a surgeon. He looked at his hands, which once held the steering wheel of a patrol car, which commanded respect, and now seemed empty, useless. The uniform, which gave him identity, was now just a distant fabric, a painful reminder of a power he had abused, of an authority he had tarnished. Shame was a slow poison, corroding his self-esteem, his masculinity, his very essence. How could he rise again? How could he look at Ana, at his children, and ask forgiveness for something so destructive? The house, once a sanctuary of peace and security, now seemed like a judgment arena, each object a silent witness to his fall. Ana continued to write, her mind focused on numbers, cuts, survival. She was the rock, the strategist, the only one who seemed capable of seeing a path through the thick fog he had created. And Almeida, the once proud lieutenant, was now the burden, the problem to be solved. The inversion of roles was brutal, and he felt the bitter taste of impotence, of dependence. The federal judge had not only taken his uniform, she had stripped his dignity, his security, and forced him to see himself as he truly was, a flawed, arrogant man, and now desperately dependent on the strength of the woman he had almost destroyed. Silence returned to the room, but now it was a different silence. No longer the silence of shock, but the heavy silence of strategy, of the battle beginning, a battle for survival. Almeida knew the fight would be long and painful, and that the way back, if it existed, would be paved with sacrifices and humiliations. And worst of all, he knew he deserved every one of them. Arrogance had taken its toll, and the bill was only just beginning to be paid. A constant reminder that justice at times was slow but relentless, and that its consequences could extend far beyond the initial act. The bill, indeed, was only just beginning to be paid. Every silence in the room was a jarring reminder of the price of arrogance, and Almeida felt himself drowning in a sea of guilt and helplessness. Ana, on the other hand, seemed to have emerged from the depths of despair with frightening clarity. Her pen scribbled on the paper, transforming chaos into a cold, merciless list of priorities and cuts. She was the general on a desolate battlefield, and he, the wounded soldier who had caused the war. "We need to call the school first thing tomorrow," Ana said, breaking the silence with a voice that brooked no argument. "Check their transfer policy, the deadlines. Maybe we can get a discount if we explain the situation, but we can't count on it. And the car. The payment is due in a week. We don't have that money." Almeida cringed on the sofa, feeling the weight of her every word like a physical blow. The car, his pride, the symbol of his ascent, was now just another burden, a rope tightening around his family's neck. He imagined the look on his children's faces when they were told they would have to leave their friends, the school they loved so much, because of a mistake they didn't even understand. The thought was a dagger in his heart. The phone rang again, making him jump. It was the same number as before. He knew it was from the battalion. Perhaps an officer, perhaps a colleague who now looked at him with disdain. Anna looked at him, an eyebrow raised. The doorbell rang, a sharp, unexpected sound that made both of them jump. It was late, and no one was expecting visitors. Almeida felt a shiver run down his spine. Was it the battalion, the police, the judge? He looked at Anna, panic etched on his face. "Who can it be at this hour?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Anna, despite the surprise, maintained her composure. She stood up, her posture tense but determined. "It doesn't matter. We need to know. Stay here." She walked to the door, hesitated for a second, and then looked through the peephole. Her face contorted into an expression of confusion, then surprise, and finally extreme caution. She opened the door, just a crack. "Good evening, madam," a formal female voice said from the other side. "I am Dr. Camila Mendez, a lawyer. I was sent by Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos." Almeida, from the sofa, heard the words and felt his blood run cold. The judge. Even absent, she continued to weave the web of his destiny with every step, every decision. What did she want now? More punishment, more humiliation. The presence of the lawyer, sent by her, was a new chapter in his fall, a reminder that her justice was relentless and omnipresent. The night, indeed, was only just beginning. And darkness, it seemed, had a face and a lawyer. The sound of those words, "Dr. Camila Mendez, lawyer. I was sent by Federal Judge Helena Vasconcelos," echoed in the room like silent thunder, paralyzing Almeida on the sofa. The judge. Her name, even uttered by someone else, carried the weight of a sentence, the shadow of unshakable authority. What did she want now? He felt his blood run cold, panic tightening his throat. Wasn't the suspension, the salary cut, the dishonor enough? Was she coming to his house, to his sanctuary, to finish the job? Anna, with a courage Almeida didn't possess, opened the door a little wider. The faint light from the hallway revealed a tall woman with a serious demeanor and impeccably dressed despite the late hour. Her eyes, however, were not harsh like the judge's, but carried a cold, almost clinical professionalism. "Good evening, Dr. Mendez," Anna said, her voice tense but firm. "To what do we owe the honor or the surprise of your visit at this hour?" The lawyer did not smile. "My apologies for the late hour, madam, but Judge Vasconcelos considered the urgency of the matter. She instructed me to come personally to ensure that Lieutenant Almeida has access to adequate legal representation for the administrative process that begins tomorrow." Almeida, from the sofa, felt a shiver. Administrative process. Tomorrow. The speed with which the machine of justice moved was frightening, and the judge who had brought him down was now sending a lawyer? Was it a trap? A new form of psychological torture? "Legal representation?" Anna repeated, her eyebrow raised, skepticism evident in her voice. "The judge who initiated this entire process is now offering a lawyer? And what would be the cost of that, Dr. Mendez?" Dr. Camila Mendez maintained her composure. "Judge Vasconcelos, above any personal matter, values the integrity of due process. She understands that, for justice to be irrefutably served, all parties must have their rights guaranteed, including the right to defense. My job will be to represent Lieutenant Almeida in the administrative process, at no cost to the family, under the judge's supervision." No cost. The word hung in the air, almost surreal. It was exactly what Anna had said they needed. But coming from where it did, it seemed poisoned. Almeida watched the scene, unable to move, feeling like a cornered rat. The judge was not being benevolent. She was tying up all loose ends, ensuring there were no loopholes for Almeida to claim he was unjustly treated or denied the right to defense. It was a masterstroke, cold and calculating, which further solidified the legitimacy of her sentence. "And what exactly is your role?" Anna insisted, suspicious. "To defend my husband, or to ensure that the judge's process runs smoothly for her?" The lawyer was not offended. "My role is to ensure that Lieutenant Almeida has a technical defense and that his rights are observed during the process. Judge Vasconcelos wishes for the case to be handled with maximum transparency and rigor, and that includes ensuring that the lieutenant has the opportunity to present his version of the facts with due legal support. There are no ulterior motives, madam, just the strict application of the law." Almeida finally found his voice, although it came out weak and trembling. "But why? Why would she do this? She destroyed me." Dr. Mendez turned to him, her eyes fixed. "Lieutenant Almeida, Judge Vasconcelos does not destroy anyone. She applies the law. Your actions had consequences, and she is ensuring that those consequences are processed according to legal procedure. It's a matter of principle, not revenge. She wants the final outcome to be unquestionable, and for that, your defense needs to be heard and considered." The explanation, however logical, brought no comfort to Almeida. On the contrary, it increased the feeling of being caught in an invisible web. The judge was not letting him go. She was merely changing the way she held him. He was no longer a random target, but a piece on her chessboard, moved with surgical precision towards an inevitable checkmate. "So, what do we need to do?" Anna asked, her pragmatism overcoming her initial suspicion. The offer of a free lawyer, even if from the judge, was a lifeline they couldn't refuse, no matter how bitter it was. "We need to meet first thing tomorrow morning," Dr. Mendez replied, pulling a business card from her pocket. "At my office. I will need all the details of the incident, your service record, any mitigating factors that can be presented. The administrative process is not a criminal trial, but the implications for your career and life are severe. We need to build a solid defense." Almeida felt a knot in his stomach. A solid defense. How to defend against something so obvious, so public? He had shoved an elderly woman, disrespected her authority, abused his power. The image of the judge, with her cold and determined gaze, returned to his mind. She wasn't offering an escape, but rather an arena for him to face himself, under the watchful eye of her own justice. Dr. Mendez noticed Almeida's silence. "Lieutenant, I know this situation is difficult, but inaction is the worst path. Judge Vasconcelos does not forgive cowardice. She expects you to face the consequences of your actions with dignity, and that includes fighting for your rights within the system." Fight. The word seemed empty. How to fight when he felt so emptied? The judge had not only taken his uniform, but also his will, his essence. He was a broken man, and the presence of the lawyer sent by his tormentor was just another reminder that Helena Vasconcelos's shadow was long and relentless. The night wore on, but for Almeida, the darkness was only deepening, and now it had a name, a face, and a lawyer. He was in her hands, in a way he had never imagined possible. The door closed, but the echo of Dr. Mendez's words lingered, reverberating through the apartment walls and, even more so, in Almeida's mind. Judge Vasconcelos does not forgive cowardice. She expects you to face the consequences of your actions with dignity, and that includes fighting for your rights within the system. Fight. The word seemed like a cruel joke. How to fight? When he felt so emptied, so stripped of everything. The uniform, the honor, the respect, his family's security, everything had been torn away. And now, the same hand that had brought him down offered a tool for him to rise, not to escape, but to be brought down again, more justly, more legally. Anna turned to him, the lawyer's card in her hands, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "She's right, Almeida. We can't just give up. As much as it hurts, as much as it seems like a trap, we need to go. We need to fight. For the children, for us." Her voice was a thin thread of hope amidst the chaos, but to Almeida it sounded like another burden, another expectation he feared he couldn't meet. He felt that the judge wasn't offering a chance, but rather forcing him to participate in his own spectacle of humiliation, ensuring that every stage of his downfall was documented and unquestionable. The night dragged on. Almeida couldn't sleep. Every sound, every shadow in the darkness of the room seemed like the personification of his fears. He replayed the events of that fateful day, the initial arrogance, the growing anger, the shove. And now, the lawyer, a constant reminder that Helena Vasconcelos's web was complex and far-reaching. He felt like a trapped fly, watching the spider patiently weave, thread by thread, the fate that awaited him. Anna, beside him, also seemed awake, her breathing irregular, her thoughts, he knew, as turbulent as his own. She was calculating, planning, trying to find a glimmer of light where he only saw darkness. The sun rose, bringing with it not the promise of a new day, but the inevitability of the meeting. The tension was palpable at the silent breakfast. The children, oblivious, chattered about their toys, and each childish laugh was a stab to Almeida's heart, a reminder of what he was losing, what he had put at risk. Anna tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion and fear. "Come on, Almeida," she said, her voice firm, almost a command. "We need to be there on time." The drive to Dr. Mendes's office was a torment. Every street, every building seemed to mock him. He, who once paraded in uniform, now felt like a common criminal, an outcast. The office was in a modern building in the city center, a stark contrast to the simplicity of his home. Upon entering, the atmosphere was one of formality and efficiency. The impeccable receptionist indicated the waiting room. Dr. Camila Mendes received them promptly. Her office was spacious, with a panoramic view of the city, but Almeida could only feel the weight of her gaze. She wasn't hostile, but her demeanor was one of impenetrable, almost cold professionalism. "Good morning, Lieutenant Almeida, Mrs. Anna," she began, without preamble. "Let's get straight to the point. The administrative process at the battalion will be rigorous. We need to understand every detail of what happened, from the moment the car incident occurred until your suspension. Omit nothing. Every detail can be crucial." Almeida felt a knot in his throat. To tell the story again, to relive the shame, the anger, the fall. It was as if they were forcing him to open his deepest wounds and expose them to the cold light of legal analysis. He began to speak, his voice initially hoarse, but gaining a little firmness as he admitted the facts. He described the scratch, the sudden irritation, the argument, the shove. With each detail, with each confession of his arrogance and imprudence, he felt Anna's gaze on him, a mixture of pain and resignation. Dr. Mendes listened attentively, taking notes on a tablet, without expressing judgment, but with an intensity that made Almeida feel completely naked. "And the judge?" Anna asked, interrupting the flow of Almeida's narrative. "What is her role now? Is she helping us, or just ensuring that her process is perfect?" Dr. Mendes stopped writing and looked at Anna. Judge Vasconcelos is a figure of unquestionable authority. Her initial intervention was to ensure that the law was applied and that abuse of power did not go unpunished. Now she is ensuring that the administrative process, which is a direct consequence of your actions, is conducted with the utmost fairness and that Lieutenant Almeida has all his defense rights secured. It's a matter of institutional integrity. She does not want there to be any shadow of a doubt about the justice of the outcome. The explanation, however rational, did not calm Almeida. On the contrary, it reinforced the idea that he was a pawn in a larger game, an example to be made. The judge was not being benevolent, she was being strategic, sealing every loophole, closing every escape route. Her help was, in fact, the guarantee that he would have no way to claim lack of defense, making his final conviction even more irrefutable. "We need to build a narrative," the lawyer continued, returning to her tablet. "Not to deny the facts, which are undeniable, but to contextualize them. Your service record, Lieutenant. Is there anything that can demonstrate your character, your dedication, before this incident? Any stressful situation, perhaps? Any personal problem that might have contributed to your loss of control?" Almeida shook his head, feeling pathetic. What excuses could he give? He had acted purely out of arrogance. "There are no excuses, Dr. Mendez. I made a mistake. I acted unacceptably." "To err is human, Lieutenant," the lawyer replied, her voice still neutral. "But the law requires us to understand the context of the error. We are not seeking absolution, but a fair evaluation of the circumstances. The administrative process can result in different types of punishment, from a warning to expulsion. Our goal is to mitigate the penalty if possible, and ensure that your rights are respected at every step. Mitigate the penalty." The phrase hung in the air, a small ray of hope that Almeida barely dared to grasp. But even this hope was bitter, for it meant accepting guilt, accepting the fall. He was being forced to strip himself of his dignity, to expose his weaknesses, all under the vigilant eye of Helena Vasconcelos's justice. The judge had not only brought him down, she was forcing him to reconstruct his own narrative of defeat, ensuring that every brick was laid by his own hands, under her relentless supervision. The fight, he realized, was not against her, but against himself, in an arena she had carefully prepared. And the darkness, he felt, still had many corners to explore. Dr. Mendez's office, with its imposing view of the city, seemed like an observatory from which one could see the world Almeida was losing. Every word he uttered, every detail of that fateful day, was a brick less in the wall of his dignity, a public confession of his downfall. He felt naked, exposed not only to the lawyer, but to an invisible judgment that Judge Vasconcelos had masterfully orchestrated. Her help was not a rescue, but a gilded trap, ensuring that his professional execution was impeccable, leaving no room for appeals or claims of injustice. Dr. Mendez, with her digital pen gliding over the tablet, was the scribe of this humiliation. Her eyes, though devoid of explicit judgment, registered every hesitation, every tremor in Almeida's voice. She was not there to comfort him, but to dissect the event, to extract the maximum information for the defense that deep down he knew was merely a formality to legitimize his conviction. "Lieutenant, you mentioned anger," the lawyer said, her voice breaking the heavy silence that followed his narrative. "Can you describe what you felt at that moment? Was there any specific trigger besides the scratch on the car?" Almeida took a deep breath, the air feeling dense and heavy. It was the insolence, the way she spoke, as if I were nobody. I, an officer, being disrespected by an elderly woman. My authority was questioned. I felt I needed to reassert who I was. Anna squeezed Almeida's hand, a gesture of support he barely registered. Shame was a heavy, suffocating cloak. He had shoved a woman because of his wounded ego, because of a perceived disrespect. The truth was brutal, and Dr. Mendez was forcing him to face it, unfiltered. "And did you know who she was at that moment?" the lawyer asked, the question rhetorical, but necessary for the record. "No," Almeida replied, his voice almost a whisper. "If I had known. Of course I wouldn't have acted that way." The lie was obvious, even to him. The truth was, even if he had known, his pride might have blinded him. Arrogance was a disease, and he was in its terminal stage. "I understand." Dr. Mendez nodded, without changing her expression. "That's important. The lack of knowledge of her identity can be a mitigating factor regarding the intent to disrespect a superior authority. Although it does not minimize the act of physical aggression, Almeida felt a glimmer of hope, as tenuous as the sunlight barely entering the room, but it was empty hope. He knew the judge would not forgive him for his ignorance, but for his arrogance. She was not interested in mitigating factors, but in justice, her justice. "Now, about your service record," the lawyer continued, changing the subject. "Are there any commendations, praises, or even an extremely stressful situation that might have affected your judgment? Any previous incident that demonstrates your good character?" He tried to search his memory, but everything seemed insignificant compared to the magnitude of his mistake. The commendations, the praises, the successful missions, everything had been erased by a single act of imprudence. I've always been a good officer, Dr. Mendez. Dedicated. Never had serious disciplinary problems. Always served with honor. The word honor sounded hollow, an echo of something he had lost. Anna intervened, her voice a little stronger. "He's an exemplary father, Dr. Mendez. Always been very dedicated to his family, to his work. This incident, it's not who he really is." The lawyer looked at Anna, a small sign of recognition in her eyes. "I understand, Mrs. Anna, and that will be taken into consideration. However, the administrative process is based on facts and evidence. We need concrete elements. Has the lieutenant been through any recent stressful situations? Financial, family, health problems?" Almeida shook his head. "No more than usual, the daily pressures, the routine. Nothing that justifies what I did." He didn't want to blame anyone, not even the circumstances. The fault was his, and he felt its weight crushing him. "Right," Dr. Mendez said, finishing her notes. "The administrative process will be formally initiated next week. The battalion is already preparing the documentation. Witnesses will be heard, and the lieutenant will have the opportunity to present his defense. My role will be to ensure that all procedures are followed correctly and that your rights are respected. Judge Vasconcelos, through her office, will be closely monitoring the case, ensuring transparency and impartiality." The phrase, "closely monitoring the case," resonated in Almeida's mind like a sentence. She wouldn't let him escape. She wouldn't allow her justice to be tainted by any procedural flaw. He was her project, her example, and she would see him through to the end. "What's the worst-case scenario?" Anna asked, her voice choked, fear finally overcoming her facade of strength. Dr. Mendez closed the tablet, her eyes fixed on Almeida. "The worst-case scenario, Mrs. Anna, is expulsion from the corporation, with the loss of all benefits inherent to the position and a permanent stain on his military record. The best-case scenario, given the gravity of the act and its repercussions, would be a severe suspension, with demotion and a disciplinary record that would affect his career progression. Judge Vasconcelos made it clear that she expects an exemplary but fair punishment. Exemplary but fair. The words were a cruel paradox. Her justice was his ruin. Almeida felt a chill run down his spine. Expulsion. The loss of everything. The idea of no longer wearing the uniform, of no longer being an officer, was like having his identity ripped away. He was a man without a name, without purpose, without a future. The judge had not only brought him down, she was forcing him to witness his own annihilation, step by step, under the pretext of a fair process. The fight, he realized again, was not to win, but to survive, to mitigate the pain of a defeat that was already sealed. And the darkness, he knew, still had many abysses to reveal. The phrase from Dr. Mendez, exemplary but fair, echoed in Almeida's mind, a cruel paradox that twisted in his stomach. Her justice was his ruin. expulsion, the loss of everything. The idea of no longer wearing the uniform, of no longer being an officer, was like having his identity ripped away piece by piece. He was a man without a name, without purpose, without a future. The judge had not only brought him down, she was forcing him to witness his own annihilation, step by step, under the pretext of a fair process. The fight, he realized again, was not to win, but to survive, to mitigate the pain of a defeat that was already sealed. And the darkness, he knew, still had many abysses to reveal. The days that followed that meeting in Dr. Mendez's office were a silent purgatory. Each morning brought with it the weight of uncertainty, the feeling that the ground beneath his feet was slowly crumbling. Routine, once a refuge of order and purpose, now seemed a farce. He dressed in the uniform that might soon no longer be his, each insignia, each medal, an ironic reminder of an honor he had profaned. Ina tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but her eyes revealed the fear that consumed her. She spoke in low tones, her gestures more restrained, as if she feared any noise might hasten the inevitable. The children, oblivious to the storm brewing over their heads, played and laughed, and each laugh was a pang in Almeida's heart, a reminder of what he was about to lose. He watched them, imagining how it would be to explain that their father, the officer, the hero, had fallen from grace due to an act of pure and stupid arrogance. The first official notification arrived by email, a cold and impersonal document from the battalion, informing him of the initiation of the disciplinary administrative process. It was a formal invitation to his own inquisition. Almeida's heart froze as he read the bureaucratic words detailing the accusations: physical aggression, abuse of authority, conduct incompatible with military ethics. Each term was a sharp knife, cutting the last fibers of his dignity. Dr. Mendez acted with her usual efficiency. "This is just the beginning, Lieutenant," she explained by phone, her voice calm but firm. "From now on, every step will be formalized. Testimonies will be collected, evidence analyzed. We need to be prepared for each stage." She scheduled a new meeting to discuss the defense strategy, but Almeida felt there was no strategy that could reverse what was already written in the stars. Judge Vasconcelos had drawn the script, and he was merely the main actor in his own tragedy. The judge's presence, though invisible, was palpable. He felt her in every line of the document, in every glance from his colleagues who, though sympathetic, maintained a respectful, almost fearful distance. The news had spread like wildfire, and the name Judge Vasconcelos was whispered in the corridors, a constant reminder of the power he had challenged. She didn't need to be physically present to exert her influence. Her reputation and the gravity of her position were enough to ensure that the process followed its relentless course. Almeida began to have nightmares. He dreamed of the scratch on the car, of the judge's face, which in his dreams transformed into an imposing figure, a relentless judge with fiery eyes. He woke up sweating, his heart pounding, the feeling of shame and dread consuming him. Insomnia became his nightly companion, and days were spent in a stupor of anxiety and guilt. He tried to revisit the facts, searching for some nuance, some justification that could mitigate his error. But the memory was clear, cruelly precise. The anger, the arrogance, the need to assert his authority over an elderly woman. There was no escaping the truth. He had been his own executioner. Anna, noticing his growing prostration, tried to reanimate him. "We can't give up, my love. Dr. Mendez will fight for you. You have an impeccable record. One mistake cannot erase a lifetime of dedication." But her words, though well-intentioned, sounded hollow. He knew that for the judge, a single mistake, when committed with such a degree of disrespect and abuse of power, was enough to tarnish any record. She was not interested in his lifetime of dedication, but in the integrity of justice and the lesson he would represent. The next stage would be the formal testimony. Dr. Mendez prepared him meticulously, instructing him on what to say and, more importantly, what not to say. Be honest, Lieutenant, but concise. Don't get lost in self-flagellation. Present the facts as you perceive them, but acknowledge the error. Humility at this moment is your only ally. Humility. The word was a whip. He, who had always prided himself on his posture, on his authority, was now forced to bow, to beg for clemency. Judge Vasconcelos had not only brought him down, she was deconstructing him, piece by piece, forcing him to confront the fragility of his own ego. He looked at the uniform hanging in the closet, at the photos of his graduation, of his promotions. Everything seemed distant, as if it belonged to someone else, to a past that would never return. The judge had taken more than his rank. She had taken his identity, his sense of purpose. He was a lieutenant who was no longer a lieutenant, a man who didn't recognize himself, and the administrative process, he knew, was just the stage for the formalization of this annihilation. The darkness was not just in his future. It had already settled in his soul, and each day it deepened a little more. The date of the formal testimony arrived like a punctual executioner. Almeida felt his stomach churn the day before, a mixture of dread and a strange resignation. He put on his uniform for the last time with the dignity that still remained to him, each movement heavy, as if the uniform weighed tons. Anna hugged him at the door, her eyes teary but speechless. There was nothing to say. The hearing room was austere, a cold and impersonal environment. A long table, covered with a dark green cloth, separated him from the panel of officers who would judge him. 3 colonels, their faces impassive, observed him with a gravity that seemed to pierce his soul. Dr. Mendez was by his side, her presence a small comfort in the sea of formality. Lieutenant Almeida, we are here to continue disciplinary administrative process number XXXXXX regarding the accusations of physical aggression, abuse of authority, and conduct incompatible with military ethics involving Federal Judge Vasconcelos. The colonel at the head began, his voice monotonous and unemotional. You will have the opportunity to present your version of the facts and your defense. Be concise and direct. Almeida took a deep breath, the air feeling dense in his lungs. He began to speak, his voice initially hoarse, but gaining a little firmness as he admitted the facts. He described the scratch, the sudden anger, the impulse to confront. But this time there were no justifications, no excuses. Dr. Mendez had instructed him to be brutally honest, to show the regret that now consumed him. I acted thoughtlessly, Colonel, he said, his voice choked. My arrogance and my temper overwhelmed me. I abused my authority, disrespected a citizen, and worse, dishonored the uniform I wear. There is no justification for what I did. I am truly sorry. The words were a burden, each one tearing away a piece of his pride. He saw the colonel's eyes register his confession without a hint of emotion. Dr. Mendez intervened, presenting his impeccable record, his commendations, Anna's testimony about his character as a father and husband. She tried to paint a picture of a good man who made a grave mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment. But the shadow of Judge Vasconcelos loomed over the room. Though absent, her presence was felt in every question, in every glance from the officers. They knew they were not just judging a lieutenant. They were judging a case that had reached the ears of one of the most powerful figures in the judiciary, and the expectation was for an exemplary punishment. The integrity of the corporation was at stake. The hearing lasted for hours, a torment of questions and answers, of documents and evidence. At the end, Almeida felt exhausted, drained. He had poured out his soul, exposed his vulnerability, and now all that remained was to wait. The days that followed were the longest of his life. Every phone call, every email was a jolt. Anxiety consumed him, turning his nights into a parade of nightmares and his mornings into a stupor of exhaustion. Anna tried to distract him, but the cloud of uncertainty hung over the house, suffocating any attempt at normalcy. The notification arrived, a sealed envelope delivered by a messenger from the battalion. Almeida's hands trembled as he opened it. Anna was by his side, pale, holding his hand. The words danced before his eyes, cold and bureaucratic, but with a devastating impact. Considering the gravity of the facts, the violation of ethical and moral principles governing military conduct, and the negative repercussions of the incident, Lieutenant Almeida is expelled from the corporation, with the loss of all benefits inherent to the position and a permanent record of his conduct in military files. Almeida's world collapsed. The air left his lungs. The word expelled echoed in his mind, a death knell announcing the end of everything. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, the room spinning. Anna let out a small cry, tears streaming freely down her face. Judge Vasconcelos had kept her promise. It hadn't been a suspension nor a demotion. It was the complete annihilation of his career, of his identity. The uniform, which he had worn with such pride, was now a symbol of his shame. The following days were a blur of pain and humiliation. He had to hand over his uniform, his weapon, his identification, each item, a part of who he was, now ripped away. The weight of the uniform in his hands before being returned was unbearable. It was the end of a chapter, of a lifetime dedicated to service. Explaining to the children was the hardest part. He tried to be honest, but spared them the cruelest details. "Daddy made a very big mistake, and that's why he can no longer be a police officer," he said, his voice choked. His children looked at him with a mixture of confusion and sadness, and the pain in Almeida's chest was almost physical. Arrogance, he realized, had been completely crushed. There was no more rank to display, no more authority to abuse. He was just a man, without a uniform, without the shield of his position. The judge had not only brought him down, she had deconstructed him, piece by piece, forcing him to confront the fragility of his own ego. She had stripped him of everything that made him feel superior, leaving him naked before his own humanity and his mistakes. Rage and resentment gave way to a strange clarity. He had lost everything, but somehow he had gained himself. A humble self, broken but real. The road ahead was uncertain, full of challenges and the need to rebuild a life from scratch. But for the first time in a long time, Almeida felt that although darkness still surrounded him, he was no longer fighting it with the same blindness. He had been forced to see, to accept. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the true justice that Judge Vasconcelos had sought. The end of his arrogance was the beginning of his redemption. End.